Harlem did not respect noise. It respected control. And in an era where men measured power by how loud they could be, how quickly they could strike, and how much fear they could leave behind, there existed one man who seemed to operate outside of that logic entirely. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson did not announce himself when he entered a room, did not rely on raised voices or sudden movements. And yet, in the quiet spaces where decisions were made and reputations were shaped, his presence carried a weight that others spent entire lifetimes trying to achieve. It wasn't fear, not in the way most men understood it, but something deeper, something steadier, something that felt like inevitability rather than intimidation. Years earlier, before the balance of Harlem had settled into its fragile rhythm, there had been chaos unpredictable, dangerous, and often fueled by men who believed power was something you seized quickly or lost forever. Among them was Dutch Schultz, a man whose name traveled faster than his footsteps, whose influence stretched across territories with a kind of ruthless efficiency that left little room for opposition. Where Dutch believed in dominance, in forcing outcomes, Bumpy believed in something far more difficult to maintain: control without noise, authority without spectacle. Their paths were never meant to align, and yet, history has a way of bringing opposites into the same room, not for conflict alone, but for contrast. It was in one of those rooms, dimly lit, filled with men who understood the stakes without needing them explained, that Bumpy first demonstrated the difference between reaction and restraint. There had been tension that night, the kind that settled into the bones of everyone present, a disagreement that could have easily tipped into something irreversible. Voices had risen, hands had moved too quickly, and the atmosphere had tightened like a wire ready to snap. Dutch Schultz, never one to wait for resolution, leaned forward with the impatience of a man used to getting his way, his tone sharp, his presence pressing against the room like a storm waiting to break. And yet, Bumpy did not respond in kind. He did not raise his voice to match Dutch's, did not mirror the aggression that filled the space. Instead, he remained seated, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable, as though the chaos unfolding around him existed on a different level than the one he operated on. When he finally spoke, it wasn't loudly, wasn't forcefully, but it was enough. The room shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but in a way that felt almost imperceptible until you realized that the tension had begun to dissolve, that the outcome had already been decided without anyone needing to declare it. That moment became a story, and like all stories in Harlem, it traveled not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was rare. Men talked about it in quiet conversations, in passing remarks, in the subtle acknowledgement that there was something different about Bumpy Johnson, something that could not be easily defined or replicated. And as time moved forward, that difference became his strength, his reputation, and eventually, the reason why others began to rely on him, not just for protection or influence, but for something far less tangible: stability. But stability is never permanent, especially in a world built on shifting loyalties and quiet ambitions. Among those who came to stand near Bumpy, close enough to learn, close enough to benefit, was a man named Eddie Carroll. He was not remarkable at first glance, not in the way that drew immediate attention, but he possessed something that made him useful: patience. Eddie watched more than he spoke, learned more than he revealed, and over time he earned a place within Bumpy's circle, not through force or insistence, but through consistency. He became someone who could be trusted with small responsibilities, then larger ones, until eventually he was standing in rooms where decisions were made, absorbing the rhythm of how power moved when it wasn't being forced. Bumpy saw potential in him, though he never said it outright. He didn't offer praise easily, didn't build men up with words, but he gave them something far more valuable: opportunity. And for a while, Eddie carried that opportunity with care, understanding that proximity to a man like Bumpy Johnson was not something to take lightly. He observed the way Bumpy handled conflict without escalation, the way he listened before speaking, the way he allowed others to reveal themselves rather than forcing conclusions. It was a kind of discipline that required more strength than most men realized, and for a time, Eddie believed he understood it. But understanding something and becoming it are not the same. The turning point came quietly, as these things often do, not with a dramatic event or a clear moment of choice, but with a series of smaller decisions that began to shift Eddie's perspective. He started to see opportunity not as something to be earned, but as something to be taken. He began to believe that the calm authority Bumpy carried was something he could replicate without fully understanding the foundation it was built on. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, his patience turned into calculation, not the kind that builds, but the kind that waits for the right moment to take more than it should. There was a deal won that required trust, discretion, and, above all, integrity. Bumpy had arranged it carefully, ensuring that all sides understood their roles, their expectations, and the boundaries that could not be crossed. Eddie was given responsibility within that deal, a sign that Bumpy saw him not just as someone who could follow instructions, but as someone who could be relied upon when it mattered. It was, in many ways, a test, though not one that was ever announced, and Eddie failed it. He didn't fail it loudly, didn't create a scene or draw attention to himself. Instead, he made a choice that, on the surface, seemed small, a shift in loyalty, a decision to prioritize his own gain over the trust that had been placed in him. He believed, as many do in moments like that no one would notice, that the system was too complex, the people too occupied, for his actions to stand out. But what he underestimated was not the visibility of his choice, it was the clarity of Bumpy's awareness. Bumpy did not react immediately. He did not confront Eddie in front of others, did not expose the betrayal, or demand an explanation. Instead, he watched, allowing the full shape of Eddie's actions to reveal themselves, giving him the space to either correct his course or continue down the path he had chosen. It was a form of patience that few understood, not passive, not indifferent, but deliberate. And when it became clear that Eddie had no intention of turning back, that he had convinced himself he could move forward without consequence, Bumpy made a decision of his own. He let him go. No announcement, no pursuit, no immediate consequence, just silence. To most, it seemed like nothing had happened at all. But in Harlem, silence from a man like Bumpy Johnson was never empty. It was meaning. It was memory. It was time. And as Eddie Caro disappeared into a life he believed he had secured for himself, building distance between who he had been and who he now pretended to be, he carried with him something he could never quite shake. Not fear, not exactly, but a quiet awareness buried beneath years of routine and self-justification, that somewhere, somehow, the moment he had chosen himself over honor had not been forgotten. And in Harlem, forgotten and forgiven were never the same thing. The city continued, as it always did, moving forward without pause, reshaping itself around new faces, new stories, new conflicts. Bumpy Johnson remained at its center, not loudly, not visibly, but undeniably guiding its rhythm with the same composed presence that had defined him from the beginning. To those who knew him, nothing had changed. To those who didn't, everything felt stable in a way they couldn't quite explain. But beneath that stability, beneath the calm surface of a man who never raised his voice, there existed a memory that had not yet reached its conclusion. And somewhere far from Harlem, a man who believed he had escaped, it was about to learn that time does not erase decisions, it reveals them. Sometimes the quietest men are the ones who never forget. 11 years is long enough for a man to build a new life, but not long enough to outrun the version of himself he chose to leave behind. And Eddie Caro had spent every one of those years convincing himself that distance was the same thing as escape. He moved carefully at first, changing cities, changing routines, never staying anywhere long enough for familiarity to turn into recognition, but time has a way of softening even the sharpest caution, and slowly, almost without realizing it, Eddie allowed himself to settle. He found work that required little attention, built connections that asked few questions, and constructed a life that looked stable enough from the outside to feel real. Yet beneath that surface, in the quiet moments between conversations, in the seconds just before sleep, there was always something lingering, an unfinished thought, a memory that refused to fade completely, a name he never spoke but never truly forgot. He told himself that Bumpy Johnson had moved on, that Harlem had changed, that whatever loyalty he had broken had been replaced by newer alliances, newer concerns, newer priorities. After all, men like Bumpy did not waste time chasing ghosts. And Eddie had made himself into one distant, irrelevant, no longer part of the world he had once stood so close to. It was a comforting belief, one that allowed him to breathe a little easier each year, to look over his shoulder a little less. Often, until eventually, he reached a point where the tension that had once followed him everywhere began to loosen its grip. But what Eddie never understood was that Bumpy Johnson did not operate on urgency, he operated on certainty. Back in Harlem, the city had evolved in ways that only those who lived within its rhythm could truly understand. Faces had come and gone, alliances had shifted, and the chaos that once defined its streets had settled into something quieter, more controlled. And at the center of that control was still Bumpy, not louder, not more visible, but more precise than ever before. He had not forgotten Eddie, not even for a moment, but he had never treated that memory as something that required immediate action. Instead, he carried it the way he carried everything else, with patience, with clarity, and with the understanding that the right moment was never something you forced, but something you recognized when it arrived. There were men around him who had questioned it over the years, though never directly. They wondered why someone who had been trusted so closely had been allowed to walk away without consequence, why a betrayal that could have been addressed swiftly had been left unresolved. But Bumpy never explained himself, never offered justification or reasoning, because to him, the answer was simple in a way that did not require words. Some lessons were not meant to be delivered immediately, and some truths required time to reveal themselves fully, not just to the man who had committed the act, but to everyone who would one day witness its conclusion. And then, quietly, almost without announcement, the moment began to take shape. It started with a name Eddie Caro spoken in a conversation that wasn't meant to carry weight, just a passing mention, a small piece of information that found its way back to Harlem through the natural flow of connections that never truly broke, no matter how far someone traveled. He was back in New York, someone said, not permanently, not boldly, but cautiously, as if testing whether the city still remembered him. He had business, they said, something temporary, something that would not require him to stay long enough to be noticed. But Harlem notices everything. When the information reached Bumpy, there was no visible reaction, no shift in expression, no indication that anything of significance had just been placed in front of him. He listened, as he always did, absorbing the details without interruption, without commentary, and when the conversation ended, he simply nodded, as though he had been given a piece of information that required no immediate response. To anyone watching, it would have seemed insignificant, just another name, another movement in a city full of both. But those who truly understood Bumpy knew better. Because when he said nothing, it was never because there was nothing to say. Eddie, on the other hand, stepped back into New York with a confidence that felt earned, though it had never truly been tested. The city was familiar and unfamiliar all at once, its streets carrying echoes of the past while presenting themselves as something new, something changed. He moved through it carefully at first, aware that memory had a way of attaching itself to places, but as the days passed and nothing happened, no confrontation, no recognition, no sign that his return had been noticed, he began to relax into The illusion he had spent years building. He told himself that the past had finally let him go. That was his first mistake. The second was believing that he could walk into certain places and remain unseen. The restaurant on Lenox Avenue was not loud, not flashy, not the kind of place that drew attention from those who didn't understand its significance. It was quiet in a way that felt intentional, its atmosphere shaped not by decoration or design, but by the kind of people who chose to be there. Conversations were measured, movements deliberate, and there was an unspoken understanding among those present that this was not a place for unpredictability. Eddie didn't know that. Or perhaps, more accurately, he didn't allow himself to know it. He walked in as he had walked into many places over the past 11 years, with the confidence of someone who believed he had earned the right to move freely, to exist without the weight of his past pressing against him. He took a seat without hesitation, ordered his drink without concern, and allowed himself the small satisfaction of feeling normal, of feeling like just another man in a room that held no history for him. But the room shifted. It didn't happen all at once, didn't announce itself in a way that could be easily identified, but there was a subtle change in the air, a quiet adjustment in the rhythm of the space that only those attuned to it would notice. Conversation softened slightly, movements became more deliberate, and the kind of awareness that exists beneath the surface of calm began to settle in. Eddie felt it before he understood it. A slight tightening in his chest, a faint sense that something had changed, though he couldn't immediately identify what. He glanced around casually at first, his gaze moving from table to table, searching for something that would explain the shift, something that would allow him to dismiss it as coincidence or imagination. And then he saw him, not entering the room, not drawing attention, not commanding presence in the way most men would, but already there, already seated, already aware. Bumpy Johnson. There was no reaction in Bumpy's expression, no recognition displayed outwardly, no acknowledgement that the man he had not seen in 11 years was now sitting within the same space. But that absence of reaction was, in itself, the recognition. It was controlled, deliberate, and unmistakable. Eddie's breath caught for just a moment, not long enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough for him to feel it. The illusion he had built over the years didn't shatter all at once. It cracked, slowly, quietly, as realization began to take hold. This was not coincidence. This was not chance. This was timing, and Bumpy had always been patient with time. For a moment, Eddie considered leaving. The thought came quickly, instinctively, the same instinct that had guided him years ago when he chose to walk away from something he knew he shouldn't have. But just as quickly as the thought appeared, it began to fade, replaced by something else, something heavier, something more difficult to ignore. Because walking away had never truly worked the first time. And deep down, he knew it wouldn't work now. Bumpy did not call out to him. He did not gesture. He did not make a scene. He simply looked up once, briefly, his gaze steady and calm, and then returned his attention to the table in front of him, as though nothing of importance had just occurred. But that single glance carried more meaning than any words could have, and Eddie understood it immediately. It was not an invitation. It was a decision already made. Each step Eddie took toward that table felt like a step backward through time, through the years he had spent trying to distance himself from this very moment. The noise of the room seemed to fade, not because it had stopped, but because his focus had narrowed to a single point, the man sitting at table 7, waiting without. Waiting, aware without reacting. When he reached the table, Bumpy gestured lightly to the empty chair across from him, his movement calm, almost casual, as though this were an ordinary meeting between two men with no history between them. But there was nothing ordinary about. Eddie sat, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Because sometimes, the most powerful moments are the ones where nothing needs to be said at all. And in that silence, 11 years finally caught up with him. Sometimes the past doesn't chase you. It simply waits for you to come back. Silence, in most rooms, is empty, something to be filled, avoided, or broken as quickly as possible. But at table 7, it carried a presence of its own, something dense and deliberate, as though every unspoken word between Bumpy Johnson and Eddie Carroll had been waiting years for this exact moment to settle into place. Eddie had imagined this meeting before, in fragments, in restless nights where memory refused to stay buried. But in those imagined versions, there had always been noise, anger, accusation, something sharp enough to justify fear. What he had never prepared for was this stillness, this absence of hostility that somehow felt heavier than any threat he could have anticipated. Bumpy sat across from him as if time had not passed at all, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady, his presence unchanged in the way only a man rooted deeply in himself could remain unchanged. There was no urgency in him, no sign that he had been waiting for this moment, and yet everything about him suggested that this moment had always been inevitable. Eddie tried to meet his eyes fully, but there was something in Bumpy's calm that made it difficult, not because it was intimidating in the traditional sense, but because it reflected something Eddie had spent years avoiding. Clarity. The waiter approached briefly, placing a glass of water near Bumpy without interruption, without question, and then stepping away as quietly as he had arrived. It was a small gesture, almost invisible, but it reinforced something Eddie was only beginning to understand, that this space, this moment, operated on Bumpy's rhythm, not his own. There would be no rushing through this, no forcing it to end quickly. Whatever this was, it would unfold exactly as it was meant to. When Bumpy finally spoke, his voice was low and measured, carrying none of the weight of accusation, yet somehow holding all of its meaning. 11 years, he said, not as a question, not as a statement demanding response, but as an acknowledgement of time itself. The words settled between them, simple, undeniable, and complete. Eddie nodded slightly, though the motion felt insufficient, as though no gesture could properly respond to what those 2 words represented. He wanted to explain, to justify, to reshape the narrative in a way that made his decision seem less like betrayal and more like necessity. But even as the thoughts formed, they felt hollow, rehearsed, disconnected from the reality of the man sitting across from him. Bumpy didn't press him. He didn't ask why, because he already knew. Instead, he reached for his glass, taking a slow sip before setting it back down with the same deliberate care he seemed to apply to everything. Time does something to a man, he continued, his tone unchanged. Not the way people think. It doesn't erase things. It doesn't fix them either. It just shows them clearer. Eddie swallowed, the truth in those words landing with a weight that felt impossible to deflect. He had spent 11 years believing that time had softened. What he had done had diluted its significance, had allowed him to step away from it without consequence. But sitting here now, under the steady presence of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be heard, he understood that time had done something else entirely. It had preserved the moment. Bumpy leaned forward slightly, not aggressively. Not in a way that suggested confrontation, but in a way that brought his presence closer, sharper, more defined. "You remember the deal," he said, and again, it wasn't a question. Eddie's fingers stood affecting subtly against the edge of the table. Of course he remembered. He remembered every detail of it, every decision, every moment leading up to the one choice that had changed everything. It wasn't the deal itself that haunted him. It was the point where he had decided to step outside of it, to take something that wasn't his, to believe that he could do so without unraveling the trust that had been placed in him. "I thought," Eddie began, his voice quieter than he expected, but the words stopped there, unfinished, because even he could hear how insufficient they sounded. Bumpy raised a hand slightly, not to silence him forcefully, but to pause the direction of the culprit raised his hand. The Bumpy raised his hand slightly, not to silence him forcefully, but to pause the direction of the conversation. And truth, when delivered without emotion, has a way of cutting deeper than anything else. Eddie looked down. Briefly, his gaze falling to the surface of the table, as if it could offer some form of grounding, some way to escape the weight of what was being laid bare in front of him. For years he had framed his actions as survival, as necessity, as something that had been required in the moment. But Bumpy wasn't allowing him that narrative. He wasn't attacking it. He was simply removing it, stripping it away until all that remained was the decision itself, clear and undeniable. "I didn't come back for trouble," Eddie said finally, the words sounding weaker than he intended, more like an admission than a defense. Bumpy nodded once, as though acknowledging the statement without assigning it any real significance. "Trouble doesn't need an invitation," he replied. "It just needs a memory." The room around them continued to move, conversations resuming in quiet tones, glasses clinking softly, the normal rhythm of the restaurant re-establishing itself. But at table 7, time still felt suspended, held in place by something deeper than the surface of the moment. Eddie could feel it now, the inevitability he had spent years avoiding, not as a threat, but as a realization that this encounter was not about what might happen next. It was about what had already happened. Bumpy reached into his coat again. And this time, Eddie didn't flinch, didn't allow his mind to jump to conclusions. That wasn't his way. What he placed on the table was something smaller, more personal, a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, the kind that had been handled more than once, carried over time rather than kept hidden away. He unfolded it carefully, smoothing it out before turning it toward Eddie. It was a letter. Not long, not formal, but written in a way that felt deliberate, each word chosen with care. Eddie recognized the handwriting immediately. It was his own. His breath caught again, this time not from fear, but from something deeper, something closer to recognition. "I kept it," Bumpy said quietly. Eddie stared at the letter, his mind pulling him back to the moment he had written it, back to a version of himself that had still understood what loyalty meant, what trust required. It had been written before the betrayal, before the decision that had changed everything, a promise made in ink, simple and direct, stating that he would stand by what had been built, that he would not compromise it for anything. Had done exactly that. "I wanted to see," Bumpy continued, "if you remembered who wrote this, or if you just remembered what you got out of forgetting it." The words didn't accuse him. They didn't need to. Because Eddie could see it now, more clearly than he ever had, the gap between who he had been and who he had become, not shaped by circumstance, not forced by necessity, but chosen, step by step, decision by decision. For the first time since sitting down, Eddie didn't try to defend himself. He didn't try to explain. He just looked at the letter, then back at Bumpy, and in that moment, something shifted, not in the room, not in the balance of power, but within himself. The weight he had been carrying for 11 years, the quiet tension he had never fully acknowledged, settled into something real, something undeniable. "I remember," he said, his voice steady, not because it was strong, but because it was honest. Bumpy held his gaze for a moment longer, as if measuring the truth in those words, not through emotion, but through presence. Then he nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that carried more meaning than anything he had said so far. "That's all I needed to know." He stood then, slowly, deliberately, the same way he had done everything else that night, not rushed, not forced, just certain. There was no final warning, no demand, no condition placed on what came next, because what needed to happen had already happened. Eddie remained seated, the letter still in front of him, the reality of the moment settling in not as fear, but as clarity. For 11 years, he had believed that the past was something he had left behind, something he had outpaced, something that no longer had a hold on him. But now he understood. The past had never been chasing him. It had been waiting for him to understand it. And as Bumpy Johnson walked away from table 7 without looking back, leaving behind nothing but a piece of paper and a truth that could not be undone, the weight of that understanding became something Eddie could no longer ignore. Because some men don't come back into your life to punish you. They come back to remind you who you chose to stop being. The door closed behind Bumpy Johnson without a sound. Yet the absence he left behind carried more weight than his presence ever needed to announce itself. And for a long moment after he stepped out into the Harlem night, nothing at table 7 seemed to move forward. Eddie Carroll remained seated, his hands resting near the edge of the table, the letter unfolded in front of him like a mirror he could no longer look away from, and the photograph beside it, anchoring the past to the present with a quiet, undeniable finality. Around him, the restaurant slowly returned to its natural rhythm. Low conversations resumed. Glasses touched softly against polished wood, and the subtle hum of life continued as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. But inside Eddie, something had shifted in a way that would not allow him to return to the version of himself who had walked through that door earlier that evening. For 11 years, he had carried the belief that survival justified everything, that the decisions made in moments of pressure could be reshaped with time, softened by distance, and eventually forgotten altogether. He had built a life on that belief layer by layer, convincing himself that the man who had written that letter, who had once understood loyalty as something unbreakable, was simply a younger version of himself, idealistic, inexperienced, and ultimately unrealistic in a world that demanded compromise. But now, sitting alone at that table, faced with his own handwriting and the calm, unwavering presence of the man he had wronged, he understood something far more difficult to accept. It wasn't the world that had changed him. It was his choices. The realization didn't arrive loudly. It didn't break through him like a storm or force him into some dramatic display of regret. Instead, it settled in quietly, the way truth often does when there is no longer anything left to defend. It was heavier than guilt, deeper than fear. It was clarity, and once it takes hold, it does not let go easily. Eddie folded the letter slowly, carefully, as though the act itself required respect. And for the first time in years, his movements were not driven by urgency or calculation, but by something steadier. He looked at the photograph again, at the faces frozen in a moment that no longer existed except in memory, and he realized that what Bumpy had given him tonight was not a warning, not a threat, but something far more difficult to carry. A choice. Not the kind that presents itself in obvious terms, not the kind that comes with clear consequences or immediate outcomes, but the kind that asks a man to decide who he is when no one is forcing him to choose. Bumpy had not demanded repayment, had not asked for loyalty to be restored, had not even suggested what Eddie should do next. He had simply placed the truth in front of him and walked away, leaving the weight of it entirely in Eddie's hands. And that was the razor. Not something sharp in the physical sense, not something that could cut through flesh or end a life, but something far more precise, something that cut through illusion, through justification, through every excuse Eddie had built over the years to protect himself from what he had done. It was clean, quiet, and absolute. Eddie sat there long after his drink had gone untouched, long after the room had shifted around him, long after the moment itself had technically ended, because for him, it had only just begun. When he finally stood, there was no urgency in his movement, no attempt to escape the space as quickly as possible, because leaving the restaurant did not mean leaving the reality of what had just happened. He placed money on the table without counting it, not out of carelessness, but because the details that once occupied his attention now felt insignificant compared to the weight he carried with him. Outside, Harlem stretched out before him, familiar in ways that felt different now, as though the city itself had been waiting for him to see it clearly again. The streets were alive, not loudly, but steadily, filled with people moving through. Their own lives, their own decisions, their own quiet battles that no one else could fully understand. For the first time in years, Eddie didn't see the city as something to navigate or avoid. He saw it as something that had never stopped being real, even when he had chosen to distance himself from it. He walked without direction at first, his steps guided more by thought than intention, his mind replaying the moments at Table 7, not as isolated events, but as part of something larger, something that had been building for years without him fully realizing it. Bumpy's words echoed in his mind, not loudly, not insistently, but clearly. It's not what you thought, it's what you chose. The simplicity of it left no room for interpretation, no space for escape. Eddie stopped at a corner he recognized. Though he hadn't stood there in over a decade, and for a moment, he allowed himself to remember, not selectively, not through the lens of justification, but honestly. He remembered the trust that had been placed in him, the opportunities he had been given without being asked to prove himself repeatedly, the quiet expectation that he would carry himself with the same integrity he had once promised in that letter. And he remembered the moment he chose otherwise, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The truth of that settled in deeper than anything else, because it removed the last layer of protection he had placed between himself and his actions. There was no one else to blame, no circumstance to point to, no pressure strong enough to excuse. What he had done, there was only him, and the choice he had made. For a long time he stood there, not moving, not speaking, simply allowing that realization to exist without trying to change it. And then slowly, something shifted not around him, but within him. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be visible to anyone passing by, but in a way that mattered far more. He decided not to undo the past, because that was impossible. Not to erase what had happened, because that would be dishonest, but to face it. To carry it without pretending it wasn't there. To become, in whatever way he still could, the man who had once written that letter without hesitation. The next morning, when the city began to wake and Harlem returned to its steady rhythm, Eddie Carroll walked back into a world he had once abandoned, not with the confidence of someone who believed he had escaped, but with the quiet understanding of someone who knew he no longer could. He didn't seek Bumpy out. He didn't need to, because the message had already been delivered, not through force, not through fear, but through something far more enduring. And somewhere, not far from where it had all unfolded, Bumpy Johnson sat as he often did, calm, composed, and quietly, aware of the world around him, not waiting for outcomes, not forcing them, but understanding that when truth is placed in front of a man clearly enough, the rest does not need to be controlled. Because real power was never about what you take from someone. It was about what you leave with them. And on that night, at Table 7, Bumpy Johnson had left behind something sharper than any blade, something that would follow a man far longer than fear ever could. He left him with himself. Sometimes the strongest men don't seek revenge. They create a moment you can never escape.